Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Welcome everyone to today's Economy Committee meeting. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag Assembly Economy for this meeting. Please may I remind everyone to switch off their electronic devices and put their phones onto silent modes, and could they ensure that their electronic devices are not placed in front of the microphones, because that does cause problems. Before we start the meeting today, I'd like to inform participants and members of the public watching in both the gallery or online that this committee is inviting people to share their views on childcare in a survey. We're keen to hear from those with experiences of childcare for preschool-aged children in London and the impact it's having on parents and families. A link to the survey can be found on all of the London Assembly's social media pages. Now to our main item of business, which is the second part of our investigation on childcare in London. Before we begin, we have a few items of business to attend to. Can I now ask our committee clerk, Jack Booth, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. We have no apologies for absence, and in accordance with Standing Order 2.4, Assembly Member Bukhari is attending virtually.
Thank you. Are there any... can I ask the committee to note... can I ask the committee to note the recommendation set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Assembly Member Boff.
Thank you very much. It's not really an interest, but I've got a cousin who had a business providing childcare, but it's not pecuniary.
Thank you very much. That's noted. Can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing actions from previous meetings? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the response from the Minister of Schools to its report Food Insecurity as attached at Appendix 1? Can I also ask the committee to note the response from the Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills to its letter on the audit on the adult education budget as attached at Appendix 2? Excuse me. We now move on to our main item of business, a discussion with invited guests on the second part of the committee's investigation into childcare in London. After the first set of questions, we'll have a short adjournment at around 3 p.m. for 5 minutes. We are now joined in the chamber by Helen Donoghue, the Chief Executive of the Professional Association for Childcare and Early Years, otherwise known as PACEY. We will be joined by Purnima Tanuku, the Chief Executive Officer at National Day Nurseries Association. She's just on her way. We're joined by Neil... Forgive me, Neil, is this pronounced Leitch or Leitch? Leitch. Neil Leitch, OBE, Chief Executive Early Years Alliance. Vic Jones, Senior Policy Officer from the Trade Union Congress. And Joanne McCartney, Deputy Mayor for Children and Families at the Greater London Authority. Welcome, everyone, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us for what I hope will be a very interesting and stimulating discussion. And my apologies, the other person who is joining us is Councillor Ian Edwards, who is the Executive Member for Children and Young People at London Councils, and Ian is here? He's just joining us. Thank you for joining us. So I am going to ask the first question. And this is a question that is for all panel members. And what I would ask panel members, please, is to, we'd love to hear, if you could keep your answers as succinct as possible, because we do have quite a lot to get through this afternoon. So to all of you, according to Ofsted, there was an overall decrease of nearly 4,000 childcare providers across England between 2021 and 2022. Could you tell us what are the drivers of this trend and what impact is it having on childcare and childcare providers in London? And if I could ask you, Neil, perhaps to start.
Fundamentally, the level of closures is down to sustainability. And sustainability is down to lack of funding. I mean, we are a membership organisation representing around 14,000 nurseries, preschools and some childminds as well. We also operate settings ourselves, but exclusively in areas of deprivation. We've gone from 4 years ago operating 132 settings to 58 as of today's date, and I'm afraid it's not likely to stop there, but it is a downward decline, and I can tell you firsthand that it is down to funding and financial sustainability. There are other issues, but that is the top one.
Thank you. Jo McCartney, Deputy Mayor.
Yes, I wouldn't disagree with that. I think funding is a really big one, and I know at your earlier session you heard about the cost of childcare and how that's affecting Londoners. I mean, I think the DfE's own figures, and I think it was from an FOI from your organisation, actually showed that actually even on the government figures, the free early education places and the money that the government gives to that is woefully inadequate for the actual cost of delivering it. And I think all of us are a little concerned that that might get worse with the extension of free entitlements, particularly because at the moment some providers do cross-subsidise the loss-making on those free places with fee-paying hours. Other issues, obviously, are workforce issues. So we know there's a real crisis in recruitment and retention in the early years workforce. So we do know that in some places there are waiting lists because they cannot get the staff to actually take on extra children as well. So I just leave it there, but I'm sure there's other submissions.
Thank you. Vig.
Thanks so much, and thanks for the invite to be here today. I will caveat this with saying it's my second week in the job, so I have been well briefed and hope to cover as much as I can for the TUC, but if there's anything that I miss or you need more detail, please let me know. Absolutely agree, funding is the core of this issue in terms of the decrease in providers. So there's some really interesting data around childminders in particular and the reduction in their pay, the reduction in their earnings. So we're looking at things like 17,500 was the average salary pre-pandemic. Now we're looking around £14,300. 32% of respondents to the survey told us that they were earning, not to our survey, sorry, told us that they were earning less than £10,000. I think when we look at the kind of the broader picture in terms of the cost of living crisis, we can see the narrative here. As colleagues have said, there's lots of detail that we can go into, helpfully briefed by my colleagues at the TUC, but I think, yeah, at the heart of this, it's lack of funding, yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us so soon into starting your new job. Helen.
I would agree with everything colleagues have said. I would emphasise and build on Vic's point around the decline in childminders. At our peak, around 2010, we had 60,000 childminders. Current projections say by 2035 we'll have 1,000 left. The biggest loss of childminders is in London, followed by the West Midlands and the South East. So it's a huge issue, and we'll come on to the importance of childminders and the work that they do I'm sure in time. But building on the funding issues is just the lack of morale, and that, you know, it's a sector that's so long relied on just that. It's like the adult social care sector, like nursing, like all our public sectors, the desire to do the right thing and have a vocation, and colleagues have just had enough. Managers can't do the books, can't make the money work, and practitioners on the ground doing the everyday work have had enough. And a recent survey that we did post-pandemic said that 49% feel their mental health is suffering and they need to leave their early years work, and 1 in 6 leave within a year. So that paints a picture.
Thank you. And Ian, online.
Hello, and good afternoon, everybody. My apologies for a very late arrival at the meeting. I wouldn't detract from anything that's been said. Funding is undoubtedly a very significant player in it. But what I don't have is a complete picture across London, and that's one of the issues that I am taking away and will be discussing with London councils. Our understanding of the overall issues is strong, but the granular detail to really inform discussion is not where it should be, and that is an area of development for us.
Thank you. I just want to take a moment out. I'm having problems hearing Ian. Is that just me, or is that everyone in the chamber? It's a bit quiet. Ian, is it possible for you maybe to get a bit closer to your mic, or is there something we could do? Something here? We can turn you up, I've been told. Take that however you want to.
I'll shout a little bit louder.
Thank you. That's lovely.
better?
That's perfect, but apparently we're toning you up as well, so thank you very much.
My apologies, Chair. I will shout.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And my next question is to Neil and Vic, and also Panima, who isn't here yet. But so Neil and Vic, is London's childcare sector sufficiently funded and resourced to meet the demand for early years provision in the capital? And you've both touched on that. And within that, could you also explain what you think good childcare and what a good childcare sector should look like, and what action needs to be taken to achieve that? So, Vic, if we could start with you.
Thanks ever so much. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because I think when we look at childcare provision within the capital, I think we have to also take into context that broader position in terms of the cost of living and the additional impact that that burden is having on businesses and households. And I know you spoke at the last committee in terms of the impact on individuals. For providers, we know that the cost of rent, of property, of provisions are much higher, and I think there's a real issue there. So I think if we, and my colleagues who are kind of more over the detail in terms of the numbers within providers will be able to, I'm sure, expand. But if we look at it as the whole, I think a core issue here when it comes to funding is not just looking at the funding for places, but it's looking at the funding for the broader provisions that come with that. So I think we really need to be conscious of looking at this in the whole. In terms of what we're looking at from a TUC perspective, we will obviously come on to talk about the position of workers and the value that needs to be placed on those individuals and those areas. But we know that a properly funded system will allow more people to participate fully in the workforce, which I think is a really important issue that we should perhaps look at in a bit more detail as well. But from our perspective, we need a properly funded childcare system that ensures that as Helen said, we can balance the books, because I think that is the thing that's becoming increasingly impossible, and that's what we're hearing from affiliate members, from parents, from carers, that no one is winning here, and there's no quick fix to this other than proper investment and a reform of the funding structure that I think opens up some of those issues as well.
Thank you. Neil?
I don't think it's unique to London, but there is a universal problem. We refer to funding, and I just wanted to put that into context, and that is that in the Freedom of Information request that Joanne referred to, the Department for Education, after 2.5 years, was forced to release the data, so they appealed against releasing that data. They specifically said that by 2021, it would require an average rate to be paid per hour for a 3- and 4-year-old to be £7.49. What they paid in that year was £4.89. So you can see there is a fundamental problem. What that leads to, coming back to the question about what should a good early years sector look like, it means that we pay really poor rates to our educators who work in the sector. The biggest single reason that they are leaving the sector, according to our research of 1,500 providers, is not because of money, it's because they feel completely undervalued. Then it's exhausted, then it's money. And so there is no professional career, there is no path that they follow. They are considered to be glorified babysitters. And so that's putting the child at the centre, putting the workforce at the centre, rather than this wholly exclusive approach, which is about basically getting mums back into work. So a good early years sector should surely be about the recipients, and that is children and families, not economics. And so that's, I think, the fundamental problem. It's not unique to London. It is a universal position.
I think Joe and McCartney wanted to come in there.
Yeah, just quickly. I mean, a good sector is also one that's of very high quality. And we are lucky, that I think it's 96% of our settings are either good or outstanding, according to Ofsted criteria. But I think it was striking that in the recent government consultation on changing child ratios, for example, there was no mention of the word quality in any of that. And we do know, just like in teaching, that actually, childminders, nursery workers are actually early educators. They're professional, and so I just want to highlight that point. And we do know that it's the quality that matters, not just the numbers that are in settings, but the quality of that provision. And so that's what a good early years setting would look like.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your answers. I'd like to now pass over to Assembly Member Bakari for the next question.
Thank you very much, Chair. My question is to Ian, who's also online. And my question is about the role of the local authorities in supporting early years sector. What challenges are you facing in carrying out the role that you have in London when it comes to supporting early years, particularly? And we could talk about funding, but we could obviously talk about the differing challenges across London, not just within your own borough.
Hina, I hope I can be better heard, because I'm also having some difficulty with the audio and you broke up in places. I believe you're asking me the challenges across London that local authorities have in supporting early years education. I think a fair bit of it will come down to our ability, and that is the funded capability of local authorities to carry out their role. And not only is that a simplistic role of assessment of the market to ensure sufficiency in accordance with our duty, but also picking up on the answers previously given. We have a role to help develop the workforce, and this around for me is local recruitment. I think local authorities can help in extending the recruitment, certainly working with service providers around retention and development pathways within what it should be rightly seen as a profession, not just childcare. We also have a role as a local authority to help develop the sector with regards to its standards, and that is something that we do through learning and development training and opportunities, assisting with pre-Ofsted inspections, helping the sector get ready for those sorts of inspections. So there are these opportunities for local authorities to contribute to the development of early years education. But to do so does require funding, and the extent to which local authorities are able to add to the funding is variable. We do commonly take I believe commonly take a top slice from the early years block grant funding from the DSG fund, which provides that staffing facility to provide all of those infrastructure supports to the sector. And we also, of course, provide the signposting where families are having difficulty in engaging in the sector. We provide a brokerage function there, all of which requires staffing, which is funded, as I say, from that top slice.
Would you say that there are specific concerns within certain areas in, for example, special needs, in terms of children with speech and language issues, particularly at that age? It's such a crucial time for those children to get support. Earlier the better. Early intervention is key when it comes to specifically speech and language, for example, for early ages. Could you tell us a little bit more about the challenges there?
Yes, there are of course challenges. Just as with schools, we find that not every setting is as equally inclusive. Some are far more engaging of children with particular special needs and enhanced needs, and some are better able to provide that in terms of the building or location that they work from. That can more easily facilitate support for children with special needs. The danger is that once they become known for that level of support, they become overused. And the burden, if I may express that in terms of the additionality of workload and responsibility, is not then fairly shared across the piece. So there is an issue around trying to increase the inclusivity of the sector as a whole, and that is common with our school system as well.
I'd like to move on to Helen. I'm not sure if Pamina's in the
yes, she has just joined us. Thank you very much. Thanks.
And I'm very happy for either of you to come in on the point of funding as well within local authorities and the early years section. But also I'd like to know from both of you about your concerns about the take-up of childcare for 2-year-olds, which is lower in London than other parts of the country. Should we go to Helen first?
Yeah, picking up on the 2-year-olds, London has the interesting, worrying position of being the place where childcare is not only most expensive, but where in the areas where it's most expensive, and the latest data suggests for 2-year-olds it's Hammersmith and Fulham, Kensington and Chelsea, Camden, Brent and Haringey. Huge variance, of course, across those boroughs. But not only is it most expensive for private fees, it's also the areas where the 2-year-old offer is least likely to be picked up. So we have this dichotomy of huge. I mean, it's common across every London borough. You know, I live in Haringey. The situation in Tottenham is very different to Muswell Hill, and you know, it's that kind of huge variance that's incredibly worrying. And I think particularly unique to London and its boroughs, but is replicated across metropolitan areas like Manchester, Leeds, etc. In terms of the local authorities and funding, I think we can universally recognise that the sector is not funded adequately. What I would add as well, though, and this doesn't help the disadvantaged families that we're trying to get to access the early education and childcare they deserve, is the mess that the funding is. So at the moment we have 8 funding streams that go into paying for childcare and early education across at least 3 government departments, a variation of subsidies, benefits, etc., etc. And with all the best will in the world, the 15-hour offer to 2-year-olds, to disadvantaged 2-year-olds, is not being taken up because it's not accessible. We did a piece of work with Job Centre Plus, and we found, and it's not rocket science, we found that actually if you're a job seeker, obviously you have to go to your job centre, and if you have the opportunity to have a conversation with another human being who will talk to you on your terms and explain to you the childcare offer that is there, help you through the paperwork, then the take-up was brilliant. And so we're constantly coming across these barriers built by bureaucracy and a mess, and it's just a reflection on how there's no strategic impetus to get this right. Even if we just use the money we've got, we could be using that pot of money better.
Pamima, have you got anything to add?
Yes, I just want to add what Helen said, really. In terms of funding, I think, London providers, and of course the cost of childcare is the highest compared to anywhere else in the country. But equally, when it comes to funding, we have carried out freedom of information requests to all local authorities across the last 4 years, really, since COVID. And the lowest funding rate in Bromley is about £5.51. And compared to the borough literally next door could be about £8.50. So the variation in terms of the hourly rates that they get from local authorities is absolutely enormous, not only across the country, but just purely in London as well. And I think, 19 local authorities have actually underspent, and 4 London local authorities have actually underspent over £1 million consistently over the last 3 years. And of course, when we ask the question where the underspends have been used, in the other additional needs budgets within the DSG, some local authority reply that it's gone back into the reserves. So really the funding that is being allocated has not been spent on early years. And we haven't seen a great fluctuation in terms of the take-up of 3- and 4-year-olds or 2-year-olds to be able to explain why such high levels of underspends are actually, provided by local authorities and going back into reserves. And we challenged the Minister last week at our conference, and the Minister promised that she's going to look at this. This has been happening over 4 years, and it totals to about 230 million of funding allocated to early years, not actually reaching providers and families, and that's something that urgently needs to be addressed.
Are both your organisations pushing for specific action, though, from the government or even the Mayor on these particular issues?
I think the specific actions, what we're asking the government to do is actually to look at the way funding is allocated and how it's distributed at a local level. Even with the new expansion plans, what the local authorities have been told that this is what they will be getting on average. Already some local authorities are saying to providers, you're not going to get anywhere near that. And I think that's a major issue, especially from September, when the 3 and 4-year-old funding increases kick in. On average, they should be supposed to be getting £5.34, but that's not the reality at a local level. And that's why we're asking the government to look at a comprehensive funding review. Like Helen mentioned, there are half a dozen different streams of funding coming into early years. Parents are confused. They don't know which ones they are entitled to and how they can access. And looking at tax-free childcare, we have got over £2 billion of underspends in tax-free childcare. And I think all these things that are underspends, which are allocated for early education and childcare, need to be really reviewed and looked at.
And just on a final point, when Helen, you were talking about the different boroughs and the, that you talked about the differences between the boroughs, but the fact that there are specific boroughs that you mentioned, like Haringey, etc., that are having such a low pickup when it comes to 2-year-olds, and specifically disadvantaged from disadvantaged families. Is English being as a second language, coming from a minority group, having special needs yourself as a parent, all of these are really massive challenges. How can we tackle that, as in terms of the government and the mayor, to make sure that it is a fairer system?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. That's the challenges that families. It's one thing, to use my example again, living in Muswell Hill with a very nice surplus income to be able to go out and afford the very best of private childcare. But it's another thing having English as a second language, having a child with disabilities living in Tottenham, and it's a cliche and it's a generalisation, but you get my point. Equally, I used to be a parent governor in Islington, at the North Islington Nursery School. And in my experience, it was quite some time ago now when my children were little, but in my experience, if a local authority takes a really strong, strategic, proactive position for their early years, education policy as a whole, but for their early years in childcare, then they can address those barriers and overcome those challenges. And my experience then, and it was a different time. It was before the current government Westminster government came into power, so there was more resources. But it was a really strong, proactive approach. And Islington is like Haringey, it's like Brent and Camden. It's got its variances, but we were able to be incredibly proactive and offer fee-paying services to those that could afford to pay it, the baby yoga, etc. But also do some brilliant proactive work around refugees and the parents and the families that weren't coming into what was then a Sure Start Children's Centre. So I think the key is a really strategic approach from local authorities to their local population. And as is inevitable, some are better at it than others. They're stripped of resources and they don't have any clear strategic direction from central government. So it's not about blame, but that's what we need.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Hirani.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick follow-up, actually, to Councillor Edwards online. Just talking to just hearing from the committee members today about the funding issues, and it seems pretty universal that it's an issue that really needs looking into. And I know in Hillingdon there have been issues about funding for the sector as well, where 3 were proposed to close and then reined back afterwards. You've already identified funding as an issue, but in terms of your role at London councils and any other work you're aware of with the Local Government Association, how are local authorities working together to really lobby this point on a cross-authority basis to government?
Okay, there are 2 questions that have been asked there. With regards to working collaboratively and across party, that is happening through London councils, and we are making representation. This, alongside school places, are 2 matters that we are pressing most keenly. You did touch upon a very localised issue, which has some very specific characteristics and is not representative of childcare provision within our borough per se. 98% of our childcare provision is provided from within the market and independent or business operations, and only 2% from local authority provision. So it isn't a material change in what was proposed.
Thank you. Assemblymember Garrett.
My question's been asked.
Thank you. Assemblymember Boff.
I'd like to know from a few of you how will the government's 2023 budget announcement on extending free childcare provision impact childcare providers in London? Please explain, if you can, the opportunities and challenges it presents for London's early years sector, and perhaps if we can go to Mr. Leitch first.
On the surface, it should of course be a great offer. But the reality is, what it creates is chaos because we do not have the infrastructure to deliver it. It is interesting that the announcement was made without any consultation whatsoever with the sector. In any other walk of business, if you made such an announcement and you didn't talk to the people that were responsible for delivery, that would be gross negligence. But somehow that plan was rolled out. We have a situation where I would suggest it's deferred, and it's deferred for a reason. This could have been done 5 years ago. The problem was the same 5 years ago as it is now. I accept it is slightly worse now, in fairness. But it is the media attention. It is the fact that, dare I say, in the political arena, others are now making early years a priority. It is the fact that votes are pretty poor in the government at this point in time, that all of a sudden this has come to the table. And the result of it is, it's about childcare, it's not about children. We have a sector that we've had record closures in the last 12 months and any other period before. Why would you not fix that part first of all so we can deliver for 3- and 4-year-olds rather than make an extension? And when government is likely to become the single biggest purchaser of early years hours, but it will be responsible, according to the IFS, for around 80% of all hours purchased. That places a massive responsibility on the purchaser to make sure it's adequately funded. What we saw in the budget was a throwaway 204 million, when in fact we know already there is a 1.85 billion shortfall. So how can that be successful? It is just appeasement for the moment.
So when you describe the infrastructure, you're saying, what do you mean by infrastructure?
The infrastructure is basically the capability for providers, first of all, to be able to expand. Joanne referred earlier, I think, or somebody referred earlier, to the fact that we have settings that have waiting lists as long as your arms, but we don't have staff to basically work within them. We don't have educators. So you need surely a good platform before you start to expand. We are turning people away for the existing offers, never mind adding anything to it. And again, it comes back to that massive responsibility. If you're responsible for 80% of all hours basically delivered, you surely have to fund it. Otherwise, this is a ticking time bomb that will just collapse. We are an operator ourselves, as I alluded to. This time 4 years ago, we operated 132 settings. So I'd like to think that when we talk about the interests of our members, we do it with first-hand experience. Today, we operate 58. And it will not stop there, I'm afraid to say. We will be decreasing further. We operate in areas of deprivation. We're a not-for-profit organisation, so we don't have to have a return on the investment. We don't have to pay shareholders. We don't have to distribute dividends. We cannot make it pay. So how is it going to basically improve the situation? We have people leaving, and I'm sorry I'm slightly long-winded about this, but I think it's important. We have people leaving the sector in droves because they can work elsewhere without the pressure, with more money. Government knows all of this, and yet it offers more so-called free hours. Come back to the point. If that was a corporate business, you would be fired.
Thank you for that. I mean, you seem to be alluding to the fact that more importance needs to be given to the the job of childcare. And in that, I'm gathering that's what you mean by infrastructure, actually building the workforce.
It is mainly the workforce.
Fair analysis of what you've said.
It is. It's mainly the workforce.
Right.
But I would also add this. If you ask anybody that made this decision, did you establish the number of settings that are able to expand their capacity? No idea. We have settings where we can't deliver on the 2-year-old offer because we take 3- and 4-year-olds. The physical building restricts it. Nobody talked to us to say, what will the impact of these new offers be? I'd suggest that it will put more settings out of business. And it's interesting that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation with Quorum did say that this is likely to have significant impact on operators in areas of deprivation. And I think that's what will happen.
Thank you. Ms. Tanuka, could you answer those questions?
Yes, I'll just add a few points to that from what Neil said as well. I think the government being the 80% of purchaser or intervener, whatever term you use, from 23 onwards is the biggest challenge, because especially when the funding that currently providers receive doesn't even cover their costs. Since the 30-hour policy started, we've been monitoring the closures of nurseries. And April 23 to December 23, we've seen 87% increase in nursery closures. And 30 of them are actually in London areas. And those are nurseries who are basically where the funding rate is the lowest, and also who are most reliant on the government funding. Some of these providers rely on 70% of their funding comes from the government. So you can see, unless they have a balance of full fee paying children and some subsidized children, because it's not free, it never will be. And I think that's something, the language and the terminology is something that we need to be looking at as well. But as soon as the spring budget was announced, we carried out a survey, and 75% of the providers have already got waiting lists. And of course, some local authorities, over 40% of local authorities, have said they have got sufficiency issues in their local authority areas. So the policy is very ambitious. And of course, one of the positives, we do need to recognize the positive, is that universal credit element, the childcare element of the universal credit has been enhanced. And from June onwards, parents will be able to, get above that threshold, which is 85%. I think that's really positive. And also positive that the parents will be able to claim that in advance and pay providers in advance, because otherwise providers are waiting for those payments to come through, which affects their cash balance and cash flow. So, but in terms of the challenges, some providers don't physically have the space to be able to expand. And of course, capital funding is required. So it's a huge challenge to start this process. And of course, government expansion is across UK. We operate across UK. Scotland and Wales are also looking at similar expansion plans. I think we need to make sure what is important for child development rather than what is important for the economy and bringing parents back into work. Of course, they both are important, but I think, one needs to come before the other.
Thank you. And if I can move to Councillor Edwards, if possible, who, interestingly, I think is sitting in my old office in Hillingdon Town Hall. I noticed they haven't painted that wall for 30 years. Anyway, Councillor Edwards, what do you think is going to be the impact of the 2023 budget announcement?
Thank you very much for your question. I'm pleased you recognise the prudence of our council when it comes to decorating out my own office.
Very good. I approve.
The impact itself is we're optimistic. First of all, we think it is beneficial to be able to extend the offer. Where we have some nervousness is around the detail of what this means. To the extent to which the increases the demand for places is not precise. We can expect it will result in an increase in demand, but we don't know to what extent. A fair bit of the offer will be replacement funding for those who are presently using private funds to pay for this childcare and will now just receive alternative funding streams, and therefore may be neutral in terms of impact in terms of the number of places. So until such time as we have full detail on the amount of money that's coming through, and until we see how that changes the demand for places, it is difficult to precisely predict how it is going to impact. However, I absolutely endorse the comments being made previously that this is a challenge and will be a challenge. But as I say, the size of that challenge, it is not possible to say precisely this time now.
It's not fair. Sure, it's fair to say that it's the most generous package of measures that we've had today, isn't it? I mean, is this a situation where more money is bad? Or?
Well, no. More money is certainly not bad. This is a very positive, the extension of the offer and the help to families, particularly the cost of living crisis. And if this places more money back into the pockets of those families, this is to be applauded. And of course, we support that. The issue is the extent to which this will add to the demand for places, whereas maybe previously placements had been undertaken within their own homes because for whatever reason it wasn't considered appropriate to be moving a child into paid childcare. That may now change as a consequence of the extension of the offer, and the extent to which that then brings additional demand onto the sector is one that we are not fully averse with. We don't know the details of that. But it is a challenge that the market, I'm sure, and the sector will respond to. I am pleased that within my own borough, the supply of childcare placements in a group setting has been stable. I do recognise that the childcare childminders has diminished quite considerably over time, and that trend appears to be continuing.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor, if you'd like to come in on that.
Yeah, no, I was just going to really emphasise the concern that you extend the free entitlements, but if you're not currently funding the cost of what's there already, and then asking nurseries and settings to provide extra free places, I think the issue is that is going to make their business model likely to fail in many cases. The other thing is that whilst extending the offer, I think the government's missed a trick, really, because we do know that it's disadvantaged children that benefit most from good early education. And actually, the entitlements, although the free offer is extending, the who qualifies is not changing. So that entitlement is extended to working parents. So I think there's been a real missed opportunity there to make sure that could have been targeted to some of our most disadvantaged children.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Garrett, did you want to come in?
No, I think it's been covered again. I have an original question.
Thank you. I had said that we would break after the next question, but as we're whacking along really well here, I'm actually going to ask Assembly Member Hirani to ask the 3 questions that he has, and then we will have a break after that. So, Assembly Member Hirani.
Thank you. And some of this has been covered as well, so I'm going to direct my questions to particular individuals who haven't spoken on this issue. And the first one, I know, Councillor Edwards, you spoke about SEND with Assembly Member Bakari's question, so I'm going to turn to Helen on this one about childcare settings and childminders across London and how they perform in terms of their provision for SEND. And do special education needs coordinators in London have sufficient resources?
I have to confess that SEND isn't an area of specialism for myself, so I can't go into detail on that. In terms of enough resources, what I will say concisely is that children with special needs, disabilities, communication problems, ever increasing post-pandemic across the spectrum, are always at the bottom of the pile, sadly.
Brenda, did you want to come in?
Yes, I think in the through GLA we delivered a number of projects, including Maths Champion and SEND coordinators programs and things like that. I think one of the biggest issue with special needs children is, especially since COVID, settings are seeing more children with speech and language issues and settling in issues. So what's happening is, of course, is that one-to-one attention the children need. Unfortunately, local authorities are not able to fund that, and also providers are not able to pick up that cost. But staffing is a major issue. We have a staffing crisis in early years, so in order to get people who are qualified and trained and skilled to be able to look after and actually educate special needs education children is extremely becoming difficult, and of course the funding and resources are not available as they should be.
And Neil, happy for you to come on this, but before you start, there's also another issue that you raised around staffing and recruitment. And in terms of the challenges that London faces, do you feel that London has any different or exacerbated challenges compared to the rest of the country?
Yes, they have, absolutely. Just talking to providers, one of the providers in Islington had to change their opening hours due to lack of staffing, and of course people commuting in London would want childcare to be starting very early, so they've changed their hours from 7:30 till 6 to 8 to 5. And of course, that's not going to fit all parents. And also, their staffing turnover is 65.8% annual turnover of staffing. And their agency bill is £62,000 for the last 12 months. So these are the big challenges, both for qualified and unqualified levels of staff. We have issues more, of course, in Greater London area because of the London allowance and, of course, the salaries, but across the country. And we have put in a submission to the UK Advisory Committee recently to actually make sure that the childcare professionals are on the occupation priority list, so that we could actually recruit people from other countries who have graduate qualifications, but unfortunately some of them who are already here working in social care, they can't work in early years because those qualifications are not recognised. These are the issues that we are addressing through the FE to actually look at how can we fast track people who already got qualifications, how can we train them up to be able to maintain that quality but also address the workforce issues.
Thank you. Neil, did you want to come in on this?
Just to firstly answer your question on SEND, if I may, if that's okay, that in the recent Ofsted 2022 annual report, it is interesting that London fared really well when it came to SEND in terms of written statements. It, in fact, was one of the lowest, if not the lowest. So actually, in practice and top line, it does very well. But from a very practical perspective, what we are starting to hear, and it was interesting in a recent all-party parliamentary group meeting, that one provider actually openly said, we will not take SEND children, and we won't take them because they cost us money. Now, of course, that is a pretty awful place to be, but it is a challenge. It is a challenge. And keep harping back to funding, but unless there's adequate funding, then it's difficult to see how colleagues can cope with the increase that Panima alluded to of more children coming forward with personal, social and emotional development needs. I spoke to a manager just the other day, and seriously, she just said to me, her first comment was, Neil, I am tired of having to pacify managers who are crying because they have been kicked and bitten by children who do not understand how to share, play, etc. Basic needs. And so the problem exists, but it exists everywhere. But I just wanted to say that London actually overall is doing okay. On the recruitment and retention crisis side, I think the big challenge that we've got, just adding to Panima's point, is that we have choice in London. And when you have been a sector, I come back to that initial point that 77% of people said they were leaving the sector because they felt undervalued. And so, and particularly coming out of the other side of the pandemic. So when you've got the choice where you can perhaps go into a job where you can spend 2 days at home because of flexible working or hybrid working, you don't have the pressures that you used to have. You can earn more money. It's not a bad place to be if you're unhappy with the job because you have options. Councillor Edwards, I made a remark earlier that I have to say I would disagree with. That is that the early years sector will respond. That is the problem. everybody thinks that no matter what's thrown at the early years sector, it will cope, and historically it has. But it really is at breaking point. And the other thing I would just say, just as a throwaway remark, is I do disagree with Panima on the comment about we need to change the wording about free childcare. No, we don't. Every child deserves the right to care and education. We need to adequately fund it so providers are not going bust, so that we can deliver it. That's a different equation. Don't change it in terms of terminology. Deliver what you promised.
Sorry, Neil, you sparked something else in my head, which sort of goes back to another committee I sit on health, where we did look at early years, which talked about the impact of the pandemic on children and children's development being impacted, being a few years behind what it should be. And if you think about 3 to 4 year olds that are coming into your settings at the moment, in that committee, what we said that should be looked at from a policy perspective is actually in specific investment in those children so that they can catch up in their development. And new children coming into the system were sometimes coming into settings, unable to cope with playing with other children, for example. Is that something you're seeing as well?
Absolutely. I was pretty appalled by something that I was sitting at home when we initially launched the catch-up program, as it was described at that particular point in time, and I received an email, and it was an embargoed email, and I never forget it, 6:08 in the evening, just got in, and it said basically that the department was going to include all children within the catch-up fund, and that would include early years children. And there were two statements, one from the Prime Minister at the time, Prime Minister Johnson, and from the Secretary of State at the time. Now, we've had so many Secretaries of States, I'm struggling to remember who exactly it was at that particular point in time, but regardless. And they both praised the early years sector for supporting children. 1 hour and 12 minutes later, I received another email that said, sorry about the last one, all the platitudes remained of thanks, but it removed early years in terms of funding. And so we were expected to carry on trying to support families and children who were in chaos. The good thing about the pandemic, in a very odd way I would say, is I think parents started to realise the importance of what our educators do and the important part that they play. But yes, we are still seeing the fallout of that at this particular point in time. It is ironic, and I have to say this, that when government was proposing to change the adult to child ratios, you had Her Majesty's Chief Inspector, His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Ofsted, on the very same day telling us that young children's development had stalled, that they needed more support than ever. And we're saying, and we've got a workforce that's leaving in droves, and what do we propose? That we give them more children to look after, because it's not about education, it's about looking after, nothing more. So I think it is scandalous that we've allowed a generation of children to go unsupported.
Thank you. It's very, very powerful testimony. Vic, I just want to turn to you quickly on this, because there's a point that Neil made towards the end about the relaxation of the ratios in the sector. What will the impact be of this?
Thanks so much, and it's a really interesting conversation about that terminology about free. As someone whose phone is pinging because my daughter's just been given lunch at nursery, I'm finding this conversation really, really insightful, because I think you're right. I think there's a nuance there, isn't there, between parents' understanding of what free childcare is and then the value that we place on that. So I think there's something really interesting there. In terms of that, the ratios, I mean, the feedback we got from our affiliates and their members was really clear in terms of these are staff who are increasingly overworked, increasingly undervalued. I think colleagues on the panel have gone into a lot of detail in terms of that strength of feeling. and there's high churn. We know that people are leaving childcare and the early years setting to go to jobs in retail and hospitality. And I can say this, talking to you from a TUC perspective, retail and hospitality are some of the areas where our members have the lowest terms and conditions. You know, we're not talking about, you know, huge leaps. And I think there's something really interesting in terms of the staffing dynamic, the morale, and the narrative that is playing out around childcare and the value we place in those educators. And I'll take that, because I think you're absolutely right. It's educators that's not looking after children, is it? The nuance there is really key as well. I think we saw there was some really interesting research from the Childcare During COVID project, which looked at the impact of reductions in funding, the kind of the crisis, and what that meant in a real-term situation. And providers were reducing the terms and conditions of their staff. They were not renewing contracts. They were terminating temporary contracts. And this just feeds into that position of it being unsustainable, because people are so overworked, and I do think it comes back to that point about parents and the value, and if you're in a position where your pay isn't being uplifted, the workload is getting higher, where is that value coming from, and where is that kind of Helen made a really good point earlier in terms of the goodwill and the nature that goes into it. I think it's a really, really interesting point. But for us, we know that affiliated unions and their members are telling us that this is something that is not sustainable, and we've seen it, and colleagues have seen it.
Helen.
Thank you. Yeah, just building on that, I think it's important to say that we haven't had a national child-based strategy since 1998. And a result of that is the child is not at the centre of any of these discussions. The child certainly isn't at the centre of the ratios decision. And just building on Neil and Pamina's points around children with more complex needs coming into settings. Back in the day, when we had a joined-up integrated strategy, early intervention was a key phrase that we heard all the time, and really important around safeguarding of children. So it's not just about children and development needs, it's children's safety. And increasingly, because we've had that infrastructure stripped down, colleagues in early years settings, be they childminders, group settings, are having to pick up that as well. So not just the added burden of the complex needs, but children that are really potentially at harm. And they're the ones they see, of course, and there's wider implications for safeguarding when troubled families aren't, or children in particular circumstances aren't necessarily being seen by settings. So it goes even further than that. It's the whole kind of myriad of worries.
Right. And I know, Purnima, you want to come back on one of the points.
I think fundamentally, the kind of, education doesn't start at school age when they go to school at 4. I think early education starts much, much sooner than that. There were 1.5 million childcare places. The majority of them, over 80% of them, are delivered by the private and voluntary sector. But if you look at the pupil premium, the earliest pupil premium, at the moment is around £380 per child in early years. Once that child starts school, immediately that goes up to nearly £1,800. So there's a big difference in terms of how the recognition comes when only a child goes to school. So earliest is always at the bottom of the pile. Since COVID, we've been talking about, it's always, I feel as if, what about earliest? What about earliest? When it comes to Thanks the Teachers Day, what about earliest? So I think as a society, there is that recognition now how important early education is, but I think what we need to do is really raise the bar and the profile and the importance of early education in general. And we've just launched a campaign called First 5 Years Count across UK. And this is a non-political campaign. We've got 100,000 people already signed up and sharing that. This is really to promote the fantastic work that the earliest practitioners do day in, day out. And despite all the challenges and problems, they are delivering a fantastic quality care. I think that is important, that we should be really highlighting it and shouting about it.
Thank you. I think that's a fantastic point to end on before our break.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Boff, before I bring you in, I am conscious that Councillor Ian Edwards will have to leave at 3 o'clock. So if I could just give committee's thanks to him for joining the panel discussion and for his contribution. Assembly Member Boff.
Thank you. Mr. Leitch, you alluded to, you said some providers were were turning away young people because of their SEND status. Is that legal to do that, if that's the stated view?
I would say, regardless of whether it's legal or not, it is just an awful state of affairs. But if you want to be practical about it, whether they openly announce it, and I was shocked to hear it.
Well, my jaw dropped when you said that, because I would have thought to absolutely state that you're not taking a child on because of their protected characteristics, I think is very odd and opens themselves up to legal challenge, and I'm surprised there hasn't been one. I don't want to spend too long on this. I just wanted to, Ms. Tanuku, sorry.
There has been a legal challenge going back a few years ago in Liverpool, and basically the local authorities have a duty to provide sufficient childcare for all children, any parents who require childcare in their local authority area. That's according to the Education Act. But also providers will have to meet the needs of that child. And if providers feel that they cannot fully meet the needs of that child, that's when they have issues in terms of they're not able to take them, because skilled staffing and because of not having to have enough people to look after and provide one-to-one care, especially when the local authority are not able to provide that funding to actually give that one-to-one care. So it's a really difficult situation, because actually providers will be in the wrong legally if they refuse it for that reason.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for that. Perhaps our Secretariat could look at getting that reference to that case, because that would be very interesting to see. Thank you.
Is it a quick one,
Very
Neil?
quick, but I just wanted to add one point to that. Sorry. And that is that I don't think that we should pretend that everything follows the spirit of the law anyway. For a long, long time, when Panima alluded to the free offer, providers cannot deliver on the funding that they've got. So is it fair that a parent would be charged £11.80 for a child's lunch every single day? Is that reasonable? No, it isn't. But there is a loophole that allows that to be done. And the loophole is there because government wants it to be there, because they know they could not adequately fund it. When we did the Freedom of Information request and we got that data from them, they said, their words, not mine, to adequately fund the entitlements would require an additional £2 billion. That is not affordable. They also went on to say that they expected prices for parents who do not qualify for the entitlements to go up by 30%. So we turn a blind eye to a lot of things, because if we didn't, the sector would have collapsed a long time ago. So I just felt that we should add the very pragmatic point to the discussion.
Thank you very much. So what we'll do now is take a 5-minute break. Actually, I'll tell you what, I'll be really generous. I'll make it 7.5 minutes. If we can, 7 minutes. So if we can all be back here by 3:10. And I now adjourn this meeting for 7 minutes. Welcome back to the Economy Committee meeting, where we'll now move on to our next set of questions on childcare in London. Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon, panel. Neil, if I can come to you first of all, I just want to kind of echo what you said about a whole generation of children not being supported, and I think that has been very present in this conversation. I think also it is a question of funding that's coming out clearly, but also funding is always a question of political priorities, and I think childcare should clearly be a political priority. I just want to pick up on the point. We've talked a lot about London compared to the rest of the country. I want to talk about London specifically now. What is the difference between the affluent parts of London and the deprived parts of London in terms of the childcare sector, both the quality of it, resourcing and availability?
There is an intrinsic link because, and I say this from a perspective of where we operate within London. We, of course, operate in areas of deprivation, so we see one side of it. But I'm also a non-exec director of another organisation that operates in affluent areas. And there is a massive difference. We saw throughout the pandemic that it was the parents, the higher socioeconomic classification of parents that continued to send their children into early year settings, whereas colleagues in areas of deprivation did not. When you have the opportunity, for example, to stay at home for 3 days, just take the free entitlement because you've now got hybrid working, it is the more deprived parents that we are seeing as an operator that are keeping their children at home. Because it's the difference between them perhaps putting food on the table and not. I spoke to a parent who told me that day, who was in tears, told me that day that they had spent their entire allocation of food for their family on a travel card for a job interview. You do not get that in affluent areas in real terms. And so it's likely to be the have-nots that will question whether they send their child, allow their child, whether they fund their child to go to an early years setting over those that, dare I say, are not as financially challenged. It's obvious, but it's the reality of what's happening at this point in time.
I think you articulate that really well. Thank you. Helen, if I can come to you. So this is a real question of social justice, really. Just to ask if you've got any comments on the inequality aspects of this.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what Neil said. I will build on the point I made earlier in that it doesn't have to be like this. With adequate funding and a good strategic approach, settings can provide a mix of services for the whole community. We haven't sort of talked about childminders for a little while, and I just again want to come back to the importance of childminders because they provide something really specific for families from disadvantaged backgrounds or experiencing disadvantage, in that they have the flexibility. It's a home-centred environment. It's more of a relationship with the whole family. They can be there to help mum, dad, the wider family, and in particular can be more flexible around the gig economy, around shifts, etc., that people might have to work around, and then not have the luxury of being able to work from home and do Zoom meetings all day, etc. However, it's incredibly hard to set up as a childminder in an area of deprivation. It's really hard to do it in private accommodation and private renting. It's really hard to do it in social housing and renting. And there are different approaches to that from local authorities, and what we would call for is an understanding that just because you're renting doesn't mean you can't set up as a childminder, and that's a piece of work that could be done, actually. And then there's just the practical elements of size of your accommodation, etc. And the need for some really positive, proactive work around promoting the role of childminders as they used to be considered, that kind of extra element of the family. And my children went to a childminder, and she was like their third nan. But that needs, across all communities, needs reinforcing, because we're losing touch with that real value that brings. And that's why the numbers are depleting horribly.
Thank you. And Helen, to stay with you, Neil and Assemblymember Harani earlier were talking about the impact of the pandemic. Just to get your view on really what was the impact of the pandemic, and is the sector recovering?
The impact of the pandemic was huge. We felt entirely left behind by the DfE. Neil alluded to it earlier. An afterthought in every way. It was Williamson that was the Secretary of State. I remember it well. And you know, education is always about schools, and the people working in early years and childcare were an essential service. They were equally there looking after the children that had particular needs and had key workers as parents, but wholly unrecognised and unrewarded. Every time there's an announcement, it would be a Friday evening, and we would find ourselves all having to say, what about early years? And we're talking about a workforce that was already fed up to the nines, really undervalued, under-respected, and they'd just had enough. So it caused a huge dip in morale. And, you know, we've heard, I mean, the COVID inquiry is happening right now, isn't it? We'll see what happens. But there will be evidence from, quite rightly, healthcare workers, adult social care workers. Well, there should be from early years and childcare workers as well, because they were working in equally unsafe environments without the protection they deserved. So, yes, we surveyed our members all through the pandemic, and as I said earlier, they did their best for the families and for the children, putting themselves on the line, getting on the bus every day, but without the support they deserved. In terms of long-term impact, it's just accentuated the decline. Lots of childminders went completely out of business. Childminders, as was said earlier, barely making an income, sometimes with partners that could supplement their income, but now had partners that weren't able to work, etc. Families that had vulnerable members that didn't want their children to go to a setting anymore. And again, lack of guidance and lack of protection. So it's caused huge, hopefully not irreversible, but problems that will take a long time to address.
Thank you. Victoria, can I bring you in here?
Yeah, I just wanted to expand on something. It's kind of tangential, but this is me looking through the TUC archives and seeing what I could find. And one of the things I thought was really interesting, we did some research last summer about key workers living in London, and the research found that nearly 3 in 10 key worker households in London have children living in poverty. And I just thought we're looking at key workers, that includes early years providers, that's, you know, childcare workers, that's what we see in that picture. And I just thought it was really interesting. Obviously the key worker data is broader than that, but absolutely does include people working in childcare settings, and that stat I think is really stark, particularly for London. 3 in 10 key worker households in London have children living in poverty. It's including our members there as well.
Thank you. I mean, that's really grim. It's grim for anyone to be living in poverty, but I think when you think about key workers and the people keeping up our economy and our society running, then it just feels disgraceful. Panima, can I bring you in here just either on the inequality issue or the pandemic, just to see if you've got any reflections?
Yes, absolutely. I think even in London, even in the most kind of affluent areas like Kensington and Chelsea, there are pockets of deprivation across different boroughs. And I think one of the issues that, you know, it's been challenged is when the 30 hours funding started, the £100,000 limit for tax-free childcare for each parent. And parents who are earning, both of them earning 100,000, do they really need for 30 hours, funding? So that has been challenged as well. So I think that is something that definitely needs to be looked at. Some providers in London, particularly, are raising funds through crowdfunding and through other charitable foundations to be able to support children from the deprived communities. So they're having to do that on their own because there is no funding for some of those children unless they are eligible for universal credit or for the 2-year-old funding. So this is happening. Providers are being challenged every day, but they're also doing some great work in terms of how they can support, how they can give them free meals and how they can provide lunches free while they're at nursery. So there's a lot of work that's being done. Unfortunately, that's never recognised because the Secretary Seen always says funding, that's all they talk about. But some fantastic work is going on across London boroughs, but also in other areas as well. And I think one of the most important things specifically for London is since COVID, the occupancy levels, particularly in London, haven't come back to the pre-COVID levels. That's because of the working patterns have changed in London. A lot more people are working sessional working or hybrid working. That meant that commuter areas where the nurseries are based, and the recent research about 56 providers, 26 of them have said that they haven't actually reached the occupancy level that they were before the pandemic. So that's a big challenge in London particularly.
Thank you. Just before I hand back to the Chair, because I think we have questions now for the Deputy Mayor, would anyone like to say anything kind of as a final reflection in this section about cost of living pressures? Neil.
Specifically on cost of living pressures, I go back to that particular quote where that mother was struggling, obviously. I've not experienced anything quite like it. And I've been in, another example was in a meeting, virtual meeting, where there was a young child, and I'm talking to this clearly a mother, and the young child all through the meeting is saying, "Can I have a biscuit? Can I have a biscuit? Can I have a biscuit?" And the whole packet of biscuits vanished on that child. And after the call, the mother said to me, "This is what I'm having to deal with." Now, it's because it is cheaper, she said, to give my child that packet of biscuits and stay at home than paying my early years care and education fees. So it's about context. And if I may just add one thing on the whole thing about the pandemic, to put it again into context. These were people, these were operators, providers that opened up their doors right at the beginning to support crucial workers in other areas. They were going home in the evening because the clinical evidence was pretty poor in the early days. They would turn on the TV and they would see 1,000 people had died. And still they would go back in to work the next day. No protective equipment, because you don't wear it with a very small child. You don't dress yourself up in big gowns, etc., when you're changing a little child's nappy. They got access to testing, home testing, just a few days before it was generally available to the public. Whilst schools, and this is not a criticism of schools, but whilst primary schools were closed and were sitting on tests, etc., early years was ignored. And you said something earlier which was about priority, and I wanted to sort of jump in there and say you are spot on, because the problem we have is not that we need a bigger pot of money, because that's not likely to happen. It's because everybody understands the rhetoric, but nobody acts upon it. And so nobody prioritises early years because it's schools, and we only see education, coming back to Panima's point, we only see care and development as being when a child walks through the school gates. But if we had somebody that really lived it, prioritised it, within the Assembly, and I'm not saying that you don't, but if we did, we'd get more funding. But at the moment, that's not the case.
Thank you. And Victoria.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of summarise sort of the contribution from the TUC in terms of the workforce and what we're asking for and what we think needs to happen next. I think there's a really clear call from the TUC in terms of free, high quality. I'm looking at my briefing here, it says childcare, and I feel like I should rewrite this and say education, because it's been really, really interesting for me, and I'll take it back to the team. But the key thing for us as well is that better pay and terms and conditions for the workforce. We know that they are undervalued and underpaid, but we know that any reform of the sector must include improving those pay and conditions. I think there was a really interesting couple of comments earlier about seeing this as a profession and investing in it as such. I think that's really, really key. We've made a couple of really crucial asks. One's around guaranteeing a sectoral minimum wage for the childcare workforce. Another is around creating a new social partnership where we can work in collaboration with trade unions, government, employers to try and agree a kind of fair pay process for childcare and early years workers. I think for us, the good terms and conditions are crucial, but having that security and dignity at work is another thing that needs to come across and needs to be embedded into the workforce, because without that we're not going to be able to retain the staff and recognise the skills and the contributions that they make to the lives of young peoples and, as we've heard today, broadly their families as well. So we're looking at things like pay progression, additional time for training. I think there's another whole other conversation you could have, I think, around access to training and development opportunities for staff as well. I will anecdotally say my daughter started nursery in January, and my goodness, the bugs that come out of that nursery. There's got to be a conversation about sick pay, about health and safety, and hats off. I mean, I don't know how people work their way through it, but there's definitely need for a conversation there as well. I think broadly, we know that workers who are in unionised employers, generally they receive better pay, better terms and conditions, and actually I think the unions have a lot to add and a lot of value that can be given here in terms of working with employers, working with government and lobbying, and this is something that we're really keen to take forward and run with. But from our position, it's so clear that the early years workforce is just undervalued and underpaid, and without these reforms, without this additional funding that allows them to uplift pay and move people out of poverty, as we've seen, we've got key workers who are living in poverty, that really needs to be a priority. So we want proper pay, proper terms and conditions, and conversations, I think, with the unions about how we can support our staff and employers to, work on some of the huge topics we've discovered here.
Thank you. You sparked one more very brief question, Chair, and then I promise I'll stop. Yesterday I was out striking with 145 migrant workers with the United Voices of the World, and some of them were talking about the problems of childcare. I'm just wondering if any of you know of any kind of evidence or research that's been done particularly around ethnic minority communities and provision to childcare. Panima?
Yes, absolutely. I think some of the reasons in some communities, we've kind of done some research. One community, Turkish community in London, the culture of using childcare is not there. So, in fact, I attended an event, and majority of the people who were there were about 100 delegates, and they didn't even know that they could actually access funding for 3 and 4-year-olds. This is going back to the times when 30 hours was introduced. Not only the lack of awareness, but also some cultural issues in certain communities of using formal childcare, because most of the time they're either using families and friends, and in fact, not just certain communities or minority communities, other people are doing that as well, simply because of the cost of childcare. But definitely there is something in terms of work that needs to be done to be able to reach those people and those families, to actually encourage them, because those children who are actually speaking English as a second language, even when they're very young, the minute they start nursery, their vocabulary improves so quickly and amazingly. Within a few months, they're able to actually have a conversation. So I think this is something that needs to be done, particularly with the migrant communities and also with refugee communities.
Thank you, and that aligns with the conversation with Assembly Member Bukhari earlier. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Garrett, you wanted to come in.
I did. I was interested, Helen, in the observation you made about the challenge of childminders in rental accommodation. I was just interested in what is actually the barrier. Is it like a legal barrier, or is it a regulatory barrier, or is it just that landlords generally put it in contracts that it's just not allowed, or maybe all of those?
From the feedback we've had, it varies hugely. So it can, and it's there was a challenge actually recently in Cambridgeshire. There was a covenant around the use of rented accommodation that was challenged and overturned, which was fantastic. But we need a more universal approach, really. So it can vary. It can vary in terms of local authority approaches and private landlords. It tends to be, in our experience, when people move into newly privately rented accommodations or new developments. And often it's an oversight and a misunderstanding in terms of running and childminding from your premises, and once challenged can be resolved in our experience, but not always. And it's an unnecessary barrier in terms of people even considering setting up a childminder service in their home.
That's interesting. Yeah, I was just curious what sort of needs to change to allow that to happen. So it sounds like it's not a sort of blanket nationwide thing. It's a very complicated. Some authorities are more.
Well, some analysis of that would be useful in terms of looking at the data on that. I think there's lots of myths. There's lots of misconceptions around childminding.
Okay.
And so perhaps it's challenging that on a national or a regional basis.
Yeah.
And then, and there'll always be the need to challenge specific contracts and small print individually, I guess, but it could stop it in advance, when people are drawing up contracts.
Yeah, I was just thinking generally within society there are fewer owner-occupiers and proportionately more private renters, for example, and so that creates, it struck me as a sort of structural factor affecting the whole sector. I don't know whether Neil or Panima, whether you had anything. Neil, yeah. Thank you. Sorry, thank you, Helen.
To take Helen's point, there are restrictive covenants. We have seen contracts where there are restrictive covenants that are written in. Now, whether they're enforceable, of course, is a different position. But again, it's probably about perception. If people are taking on premises and they are told at the outset, well, you can't use it for business purposes, you can't do this, you can't do that, then all of a sudden it's killed off. And they are reluctant, I would suggest, in many instances, to challenge the terms and conditions that apply. But again, I agree with Helen. It would be interesting to take a sample of some of the agreements and see whether it is a widespread issue. If it is, whether in fact that impacts on childminders, and that's or not childminders necessarily, but people wanting to be childminders, whether that restricts them from coming into the sector. We do know that there are efforts to try and relax some of the more hideous, dare I say, restrictions. That isn't ratios, but it is other areas. So that's been our experience. We have legally seen documents that have endeavoured to restrict people from that activity.
Yeah, it's a pretty obvious hurdle, because it's going to feel like a big battle with a council or something like that, involving lawyers and expense, and if you haven't even got a business, it feels like just a...
Why would you do it?
Yeah, it's like one of those fall at the first hurdle scenarios, isn't it?
Yeah.
Before you even start.
Oh, sorry. It's similar to the kind of myths that exist around fostering and adoption. You think you've got to have own your own house, have lots of space, have got, and going back to the scheme I mentioned earlier, the Together for Twos, through Job Centre Plus, we were able to overcome some of those myths, because when you have a conversation, you don't need these huge facilities. There are legal requirements, but it's not nearly as demanding as you might think it is. And it's about saying, yes, you can do it. It's for you.
That's really interesting. That does sound like an interesting piece of work that perhaps needs doing. Thank you very much. Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Helen. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Now we are moving on to questioning the Deputy Mayor and Assembly Member Garrett. You again.
So Joanne, I was just interested in the Strong Early Years London piece of work that the Mayor did, and it was about I suppose, a brokerage bit of work, if you like. In fact, some of this, myth-busting, information sharing, that sort of thing. I just, how much impact do you think that had in terms of supporting the sector in that sort of post-pandemic period?
This is the Stronger Early Years, not the campaign.
I think I've got Strong Early Years on my thing here.
Okay, yeah.
SAIL, should we call it that? Is that what it's called?
Let's call it that, yeah. The programme ran from June 21 to March 22. And it came out of piece of work. We actually commissioned the Early Years Alliance and CEDA to run for us, looking at the state of the early years sector in London, particularly in light of the pandemic, and reports we were having that businesses were going bust and were really struggling. And as a result of that piece of research, they made recommendations, one of which was for us to provide a 1-year intensive business support programme for the sector, which we did. And I'm sure Neil can give a little more detail if you need, but it offered a suite of support, included webinars, which were universal, one-to-one consultancy, and a one-stop shop for early years businesses on the London Business Hub. We achieved a good level of engagement with that. It supported nearly 1,400 early years providers, and it extended across all London boroughs. The website itself has had nearly 2,000, I think it's 1,780 unique page views. The impact was that was that 93% said they learned something new, and 90% said they take action and do something different with their business, and 96% said they would recommend it to others. I think it had a really good impact. It was particular for that particular time that we found ourselves in at the time. I think it was run collaboratively with London boroughs, because, as you heard from Councillor Edwards earlier, London boroughs have their own training programme and best practice sharing sessions. And I think from that, to look at the impact report, it shows that by doing that, actually, some London boroughs identified gaps in their own provision that they then undertook some work to fill. And going forward, we've provided some further funding for this current year. So those resources are still there and are a legacy of the programme and can be used going forward by those local boroughs.
So in terms of some of the sort of impact figures that you've given, I know those are the sort of things that marketing people like to point to, and that I like to be a bit suspicious of, because they can point, people visited a website, people said they were happy. Did anything really change? I suppose that's my question. Yeah. So is there any sort of data that shows, a real impact? I mean, in terms of actual...
Yeah, I mean, I think there were surveys conducted with the providers. As I've said, 90% said they'd do something different. I think there were some aspects that were particularly highlighted. So the Early Years Alliance produced a budgeting tool that I think was really welcome and is used by the sector, and whatever. London boroughs really appreciated, because it supplemented the work they were doing, particularly in a very difficult time for them. But the impact is actually identified in the impact report, and it was, I think we from memory, I think it covered 15% of all out-of-home settings actually took part in the programme, so it had a very good reach.
But it was very, you were saying it was sort of very focused that it was a sort of one-time thing with that particular situation to sort of get people back up and running, I suppose.
It was, yeah.
So is there a plan? You said there was a legacy, in terms of there's sort of a legacy funding just to keep it going, but is there a plan to do any more of the sort of big bang stuff of, I guess, actually, going out again and... I think doing something different, perhaps?
Yeah, I think things have moved on, and one of the lessons learned that's identified in the impact report is that actually in the future, London boroughs have said that actually having two websites or two sets of resources is probably not useful, because and they say that their local providers tend to go to them and their own websites doing it. So I think the resources are there for them to use going forward. So we've supported them. I don't know if Neil has anything to add.
Yeah, I'm happy. I'm happy to do that. I was just going to clarify then. So what you're saying is perhaps the lesson learned is that it's better to feed in, almost in a behind-the-scenes way, into councils, let's say, or perhaps some of the bodies who are represented here.
Yes. So it was actually done in collaboration with London councils. So I think the early years
I suppose what I mean is
Alliance went out and actually delivered it in tandem with London boroughs.
Got you.
So London boroughs had their own programme, we were supplementing it, adding extra things, and they were working together doing it. So it was a really intensive support during that time.
Just on the you mentioned two websites. I suppose what I'm trying to understand what that means. Do you mean that so you would focus on speaking to, say, the sort of the bodies and the councils, rather than speaking to individual providers, allow the councils to speak to the providers? Is that what you mean? So that would be the website that they would go to for their local council?
I think it's both. I mean, the London Business Hub was obviously established as well. So all the resources are on the London Business Hub. But I think going future, sort of back to normalcy now, London boroughs have given us the very clear steer that actually providers tend to go to them. So I don't know if Neil can add to that.
Okay, yeah, Neil. So what was your
experience? To say, it is about improving the communication. So I think what we brought to the table was the intelligence of understanding what the challenges were, again from a very practical perspective. But having the two websites, well, which one do I go to? So actually, I think moving forward, what one would look to do is to use the existing mechanisms that are in place within local authorities, and bring in further intelligence, further support, and that we think would be a better solution. I mean, I would say, wouldn't I, that I thought it was a fantastic programme, but I genuinely would say, I wonder what the consequences. It's very difficult to say, you can't pinpoint and say X number of providers did not go belly up because of the intervention.
Yeah.
What I think you can say is what would have been the consequences had they had no support, given the number that sought support. And it's an intangible, but I think it really was a valuable exercise. And I take your point about the marketing and the quotes, etc., but it's still a very high percentage. I mean, if you look at a lot of programs that are rolled out, to get that level of feedback that says we're going to do something as a direct result, we were pleased with it.
So in that's thanks very much for that. In terms of the sort of legacy work, where does that stand? You know, in your view, what is there something that's needed still? Like, you know, taking account of that being a sort of one point in time piece of work, is there something similar in terms of collaboration that's useful or needed now?
Well, I think you use the learning, you change the process in terms of communication, but there is always, we have, for example, the new offers from the Chancellor. People will be struggling in terms of assessing, well, what do I do to change my premises? Can I cope with these offers, etc., etc. So there's always going to be a new challenge. Use the principles, use what we learn, apply it to a different, if you like, cause, challenge, whatever you'd like to determine it as.
Okay, just finally, I don't know, Panima, whether you had a perspective from the sort of provider point. I suppose you're the end user of this plan. How did it look from your end?
I think from a provider's perspective, especially small single-site nurseries, which are community-based, 98% of the sector is female. And they've started that business because they couldn't find adequate childcare for their own children. That's how historically a lot of people have started. And when people who've been in business for 30-odd years, you know, ring me and say, Panima, I've had enough now. I think, you know, it's getting a bit too much and I can't manage it anymore. I have no staffing, but I'm in debt. Now, that is a very sad situation to be in, because any provider closing in a community impacts the whole community, providers as well as parents. But I think the important thing is, before they actually understand and realize they've got a problem, by the time they get the help is too late sometimes. And April, for example, we knew huge increases are coming in terms of 14% staffing increase, 19% food inflation. And on top of that, for a small provider, you know, they're treated as a private provider with a big P, and yet their home is their nursery sometimes. They live upstairs and downstairs is their nursery. They have a mortgage. That's their pension as well. So there's a huge community of providers who are single-site providers, and they are having to pay business rates which have doubled. On average, they were paying $13,000 before. Now they're having to pay $23,000 on average, and VAT. So these are the two areas. And of course, voluntary sector providers don't have to pay those business rates, but schools don't pay. That their funding is actually allocated to cover those areas. VAT. And when the government becomes 80% kind of intervener, or, you know, then really should they be charging business rates? And we've just heard recently that local authorities are charging business rates not on the size of this premises, not on square footage, but on number of children. And we've heard this in 4 local authority areas, so we are looking into that at the moment. So that is going to really impact on providers quite a lot in terms of reevaluation of business rates. So it's a combination of issues that are really having, you know, sustainability problems. So whatever system we look at, it has to be, you know, deliver for child first, and for the families, and for providers, and that needs to be sustainable.
Yeah, the business, that's an interesting observation. Thank you very much. I didn't have another question, but that's an interesting observation about changes to business rates, because as my colleague was just, as you can tell from his face, he's quite puzzled by that news for the second time today. But I think that was my final question. Thank you very much for your answers. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So if we could now move on to Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you, Chair. Deputy Mayor, what impact has the London Early Years campaign had on London's take-up of childcare provision to support both young Londoners and the early years sector?
Okay, so the Early Years campaign, our first Early Years campaign was during 2019, and that was particularly to help increase the take-up of the funded 2-year-old offer, i.e. the most disadvantaged 2-year-olds. As part of that, we also funded 11 local projects to run creative activities, and particularly to what we call those sort of hard-to-reach communities who were not taking up the childcare offer. And we funded 11 local projects, and then we have shared this best practice that came out of those projects more widely with the sector. The last Early Years campaign we ran was from December 21 to July 2022, and that was to raise awareness about the broader free early years entitlements. And that was a parent-facing social media campaign, and we have had over 74,000 people logging on, and then the site that we have sent them to the DFE's entitlements page as well. As part of that campaign, we also developed a new employer toolkit, and that was developed by the Quorum Family and Childcare to help businesses across London understand what entitlements their employees were entitled to, and that's being promoted as part of the Good Work standard. We also, as an extension to the campaign, we funded Pacey to build on some of their previously successful work that you've heard about today with family-facing professionals, and they provided training and materials to Job Centre Plus staff, health visitors and social workers, trying to raise the information available about the entitlements. I say since then, the government has started its own campaign to families, and so we were thinking at that stage about extending our campaign, because the government had stepped in, taking the same families. What we did then, we directed some of the funding that we had into the Mayor's income maximisation programme, so giving debt advice and benefit advice to families to ensure they can maximise those free early years entitlements.
Thank you. And then the GLA offers a childcare fees loan to its employees. Could you let us know how many employees have taken that up and what its wider impact has been?
Yep, so we developed the childcare deposit loan with Gingerbread, and it operates like a travel season ticket loan. It's interest free and then paid back by deductions from monthly salary over a year. To date, the latest figures I have is that we've issued 58 loans. I have to say that the Transport for London, Met Police and the Fire Brigade have their own schemes as well. So it is to try and help employees with childcare costs. I say currently the Human Resource team is exploring ways they can increase the take-up as far part of a review of all family-friendly policies across the GLA. And it's also being promoted as part of the Good Work standard to other employers as well.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Do you know if there is a breakdown available? I don't expect you to have it now, but of the GLA family, so how many have been taken up within the Fire Brigade, the Met Police, etc., so we could get more of a picture?
I can ask,
okay.
See if we can find that out.
And then write to the committee with that?
Yeah.
Feels odd asking you to do that. Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you so much. Just so that the panel know, I'm a primary school teacher by profession. I've taught in nursery, so I know from first hand some of the experiences that some of my friends are now going through right now. And it's been really emotional and really quite challenging listening to a lot of what you've been saying. In particular, I just want to say thank you to Neil, because what you're doing is speaking up for the children, and that's what we never do. We never hear from the voices of those children. They're the ones that we don't hear from because they can't speak. So I really want to say thank you very much for everything you've done, but particularly on something that you said on the need for having that stronger voice within City Hall and within the Mayor. Why do you think that we don't have a strong enough voice? Because you seem to be working quite strongly and cooperatively with the Deputy Mayor on some great projects and things that have trying to reach out to different parts of London, trying to make a difference, but something's not quite right. Something's missing. The fact that you said earlier on that we just need to have a stronger voice. I just want to bring in that point that you made.
I think you said the Assembly.
My comment was more generic, if I'm frank. One of the recommendations that I'm often asked, well, what would you do to change the dial, and this is across government, is I would have an early years cabinet minister, somebody that specifically, if we really believed that these are the most influential years This is where we shape the life chances of children. I'm a firm believer. I'm less interested in whether a child can count from 1 to 20, whether they can write their name, whether they can recite the alphabet. I'd much rather that we develop children that were kind human beings, that could share, could engage, because I think instill that into a child, the rest will follow. If it's that important, then why would you not have a cabinet minister that ensured that we had a future even on this planet? Because, you know, the way things are at this particular point in time, we are ignoring young children. So my comment was generally, I do think that we need a considerably stronger voice. Helen reminded me that the Secretary of State at the time was Gavin Williamson, and I know Panima was in this call. You will remember that I said to the Secretary of State, because the conversation was all about schools, 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 you need to remember that you are the Secretary of State for Education, for the entire education sector, not just selective parts. So I probably sounded overcritical, but I do think that action speaks louder than words, and it feels to me that people at the top, and I have to say, and this is going to sound slightly sycophantic, but Joanne and her colleagues, we have this conversation all the time. But it needs to go beyond the rhetoric, and that is people with money. People that decide where the pots of money go need to be brave. They need to look longer than a term of office, and they need to think, will we have a planet in 100 years' time? Yes. Why will we have that planet? Because we have good, kind citizens that we have basically nurtured.
I mean, I may sound, this is going to be very unusual coming from a politician, but as a teacher, and people that I know in the teaching profession, we want politics to get out of education. Is that something that gets in the way sometimes? It's the politics, that's the problem. I'm
all
asking
the time.
Quite a bold question.
All the time, because if you take the last 2 consultations that have come out of the Department for Education, I challenge you to find one element of those consultations, and we had the ratio consultation, now we've got the EYFS consultation. Find one element that puts the child at the heart of the consultation. It is all about delivering on a political agenda. So I couldn't agree with you more. Politics is the problem that we have. We don't go back to basics and say, you know, it's no coincidence, dare I say, that some of the happiest countries in the world, Finland, etc., have some of the best early years care and education systems, full stop. And that's because society values what we do with our young children. Society values how we support families and parents. We make it an economic equation. That's what children have become, commodities. I'll shut up.
No, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for letting me share my thoughts as well on this particular issue. I'm very passionate about this. It's the reason I got involved with politics, so that we could have more of a voice from children and teachers and specifically. So, but Neil, you're doing a great job, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Garrett.
Thank you. I was going to ask you a different question, actually. I'm just curious if politicians weren't making resource allocation decisions, who would be making those decisions? Very easy. The presumption is often that it would be someone who agrees with me, whoever is making the claim. I don't mean...
Okay. Should I answer? Sorry, is it...
Sorry, well, it was semi-rhetorical, but I'm just curious who it would be.
It's politicians, but so we need to be guided. I accept that. But this isn't about the political structure. This is about the political motives. And when the motives are about economics, wholly and solely about economics, return on investment, growing the economy at the expense of developing good citizens, then that is the state, dare I say, of some politicians. There are some wonderful people, like in every walk of life. So it sounds like a blanket statement. But what I'm witnessing is people that know diddly about early years and child development. If you dig deep into the Department for Education's website, there is this graphic, and it is a 5-point plan that policymakers and formers should use as their criteria for when they develop policy. And two of those elements are, one, will it work? But the most important is, who made you the expert? And we have policies being designed by people who know nothing about child development. That is dangerous. We've just come off the back of a consultation, I use that word lightly, on childcare and education ratios. 110,000 responses from parents signed a petition saying, not in my name. The Department for Education openly said there was overwhelming opposition to the change in ratios. And at the same time as trotting out rhetoric that says we're really keen to engage and listen, completely overturned, completely ignored. I'm afraid the Department for Education has no credibility when it comes to consultation and listening. That is part of the problem. That is not about necessarily politicians, but it's about the agenda sometimes of politicians.
I see what you mean. We could probably prolong that debate all day. I will say, some people say that this building doesn't always listen to the result of consultations either.
Assemblymember Garrett, let's not prolong that discussion. Perhaps you'd like to move on to question 16 that's listed.
Nothing would delight me more, Chair. Deputy Mayor, about the, it's a sort of wrap-up question, really. So we've talked about some of the things that the GLA is doing, both outward-facing and inward-facing. So other than the things that we've already talked about, is there anything else that the GLA is doing, or perhaps ought to be doing, that it isn't doing currently?
Yeah, can I just make a general point that the Mayor has no statutory responsibility or powers in this area, but the fact that he does think it's important is why we have...
Sorry, some of them are as an employer, though, so we've spoken about the GLA as an employer as well.
But I think it's an indication about how seriously we take this, that we have invested money into some of the programmes that you've heard about. I mean, the Mayor obviously had his early years hubs programme early on, and some of that is still going on in the best practice from that. And during the pandemic, and we're still promoting it, we gave some funding to one of our hubs, the Wandle Early Years Hubs, who developed a set of resources for parents but also practitioners around what they could do to support the 0 to 5s, particularly during that time, but going on. We're continuing to promote the employer's toolkit through the Good Work standard. And one thing we haven't talked about when we've talked about workforce is, of course, the Mayor has the adult education budget in London. So there's around just over 60 courses with regards to early years and child development that is part of that. And I've got some figures here that show that during the 2021 to 22 academic year, a total of 62 courses were delivered through the AEB with 5,340 participants, which was an increase of 12% on the previous year. And then some extra money has gone in for this current year as well. I convene a early years stakeholder group, which Neil comes to and others as well. And and the most recent thing we've talked about is workforce and the workforce crisis. And so we're aware that out of that London Council is now leading a working group looking at what they can do to support the workforce crisis, and we sit on that group. We're also working with the London Anchor Institutions Network at the moment, which have identified childcare as something that they want to look at. So they've established a task and finish group, and they're collectively bringing together employers but also universities to look at some of the best practice and research, and they're going to be reporting, I think, in July with some recommendations that will go to the partnership group that we'll hopefully then look to see what that is and if there's any recommendations to the Mayor arriving out of that. We also obviously have the Healthy Early Years London programme, which the National Children's Bureau will be delivering for us going forward. And as part of that, there's a suite of resources around supporting staff and particularly the well-being of staff. And one of the legacies arriving out of our early years campaign work is we've now got a free digital pack and resources that London boroughs and others can use to explain and inform parents about the offer that they have.
Thanks. Just picking up on the adult education bit, obviously that's a big budget that the Mayor controls. I know one of the conversations we often have in this committee about that, with Jules, obviously, rather than yourself, but it's this question of how the provision of courses and the interest of students and the needs of employers sort of align, so that people aren't being trained for jobs that aren't there, jobs that are there, people are being trained to do the matching problem, if you like. So how we've heard a lot about the difficulties of people leaving this sector and difficulties of attracting people in, and yet you said the 12% increase in those courses. So presumably that reflects what interest in people coming in, or
it is interest, but it's then whether that translates to people actually going into the jobs at the end of the day.
Well, that
and
was,
there's obviously there's a recruitment, not only recruitment but a retention crisis. As well. I think one of the things the government's looking at the moment is in response to something they said to work in an earlier sector at level 3, you had to have a GCSE pass in maths, which meant I think that lots of young people that would have normally perhaps gone in found there was an absolute barrier there. So the government's currently consulting as to whether that should only apply to managers and not general staff. So I suspect the sector's going to say yes to that one. And so looking forward, hopefully there will be less barriers to people just taking it. But again, I think, as Neil and others have said, I think it's just a job market in London. It's a low-paid profession, it's a female profession, it has low status, and there are other avenues available.
I was just interested though, because if you've seen an increase in increase in courses. Did you say it was a 12% increase in courses or students going through the courses? Because I'm just thinking, if you've got more students...
I believe it's an increase in participants, but can I clarify that from the team?
And actually, what I was going to ask, which you may also not know off the top of your head, is what happens to them. That's what I was really interested in, because if you've, we've heard about the recruitment challenge, and then you're talking about what sounds like a sort of enlarging pipeline, if you like, of new people coming in, and obviously they seem at odds.
It could be people going from level 2 to level 3, for example. So it could be people.
Indeed, yeah. So it would be quite interesting if you could get
I'll see if I've got a further breakdown. Yeah.
That would be very useful. Thanks very much. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Clark.
Thank you, Chair. Just coming back to this is for everyone who's not the Deputy Mayor, just sort of checking in with everyone else. I mean, with that. But in your view, have mayoral initiatives been successful in supporting London's childcare sector? And that's about things like raising awareness of what's available and the provision in London, including through the London Early Years campaign that Joanne has just told us about.
Well, I've already mentioned the work we did around Job Centre Plus, and I mean that just absolutely certainly made a difference, and I can share the evaluation of that if that would help.
I think it'd be really helpful, because I think oftentimes in the Assembly we have indications of where things have gone well, and I think oftentimes it can be applied to other areas of the GLA, so I think that would be really helpful. Sure. Thanks for that.
Thank you. I have a question, and this is to all of you, bar the Deputy Mayor, unless the Deputy Mayor does want to desperately come in here. What further action could the Mayor, local and central government take to support the childcare sector in London? If we could start with Panima.
I think both within London and nationally as well, we need a really comprehensive strategy and a review of the current kind of system that we've got. And when we talk about workforce crisis, it didn't suddenly appear recently since COVID. This existed nearly 4 or 5 years ago. I went to DfE asking for a campaign across England to be able to promote early years and childcare, because at the time, DfE was spending millions to teacher recruitment, social workers, through television adverts, through cinema adverts, all that. And of course, nobody even wanted to look at early years at that point. And if we did that, long time ago, if we had a workforce strategy, we probably wouldn't be in the situation that we are in. So both for the London and the GLA, and I think also across the country, we need a comprehensive review. And what we're doing is actually sticking plasters on a system that is not fit for purpose. So I think that's really desperately needed.
Thank you. Neil.
I would agree with Panima in terms of a comprehensive review. I think it does need a longer-term strategy. I think we could benefit from something that is at least 10 years, so there is a clear vision. From that, you can get an operational plan, and from that, I think you can get some structure. I would say that superficial programs to attract people into a sector when we haven't fixed the fundamentals are of very little benefit, because they quickly realise there's no substance in what they're doing in terms of career path, etc., and they move on. So ultimately, I come back to this point. It's about reprioritising within the Assembly where early years sits and giving it more focus and giving it more attention. Then I think you can look at developing a strategy.
Did you mean the Assembly?
Sorry?
Deputy Mayor, did you want to add anything?
Sorry.
I'm just clarifying to Neil whether he meant the Assembly or government.
Probably both. But I would just say this, if I may. The fact that we're sitting here today and that we're having this conversation is pretty unique. We're an operator across the entire sort of England, really, so we operate in just about every area. This isn't normal.
I'm glad to hear that. Well, I'm not glad to hear that, but we absolutely, you know, we try and hammer this down, and I'm really glad that that's been acknowledged. Deputy Mayor. Did you want to add to that?
I don't think I do have anything
to
add.
Okay,
no, other than
just been polite.
what I've said before. But I think, you know, a governmental workforce strategy, I think they have said they're going to develop one, but we haven't heard any details of it.
Thank you. Vic?
Thanks so much. And I think I think I share our views in terms of the workforce issues, but I think one thing that would be a really good takeaway, and I don't think this can be taken in isolation because I think the points about funding and strategy are really, really important, but we would really welcome a social partnership forum in childcare that brings together the unions, particularly employers, government, local government, to have those conversations and to make sure that unions and the workforce are engaged at a really early stage. I don't think we can address the workforce issues around recruitment and retention without reviewing the points around funding, but I think actually having that early engagement and talking about the issues, and I really do take your point, Neil, about, you know, if there isn't something behind this, it's all well and good recruiting people into the sector, but there needs to be something that fundamentally changes. Completely agree, but we would call for that social partnership forum to start the conversation and to start running with this. And with huge apologies because I haven't had my briefing with the London team yet, so my induction with them is next week. So it might be that we're kind of engaging at the right levels already, but if not, that's something we would be really, really keen to see.
Thank you. And Helen?
Damn, I didn't get through the whole thing. Yeah, 100%. A really ambitious, long-term vision, strategic approach with children at the centre by brave politicians, because they will be the ones having to design and commit to it. That's what we want. And we've had it before. We had it in 98 and we can do it again. So we'll keep pushing for that. But in the meantime, there are some things I think can be done while we're waiting for that scale of change. And although you don't have statutory powers over this, I think any work you can do to encourage local authorities to adopt best practice that we've talked about. One thing I didn't mention is that childminders in particular feel very vulnerable around the pay routines of local authorities. They want to be paid monthly, not termly or 3 times a year. Huge variances around that. End the underspend that Pamina was talking about earlier, the money that's siphoned off for other areas. Much more proactive support and directed services for those disadvantaged in our communities, and encouragement to sign up to the offers that exist, as complex as it is, and myth busting around rented property, etc. And then fundamentally, approach to childcare and early education that's integrated. So it doesn't just sit on its own. It's part of health, it's part of safeguarding, it's part of looking after those most vulnerable members of our communities. It's all part of the same community and public services that we provide. And the more that childcare in early years can be seen as part of those more valued, shall I say, areas, the better uplift it will get, and the more respect and recognition the people who work in it will get.
Thank you very much. And you've beautifully segued on to a final question that I would like to ask, and it's based on 2 points that you have all made throughout your responses. You have all talked about the fact that the policies that we seem to have at the moment are not child-centred. And that seems to be a fundamental element that is missing. And secondly, about the fact, I think it is now well established that early years is that crucial part of a child's development, but also in terms of their life chances and what happens to them in adulthood goes back to what happens in those crucial early years time. But you've all identified the fact that it's either at the bottom of the list or it's forgotten. And I'd like to ask you all why you think those two elements are missing from the policies that we have. And Helen, you did touch on this, but I wonder if you'd like to do that.
Oh, wow. I mean, I used to work for Action for Children. I was Director of Public Policy a while ago. And when I joined, the Chief Exec at the time, Dame Claire Tickell, she said to me, Helen, I don't want to... You interviewed really well. I don't want to dampen your enthusiasm because you're clearly passionate about this, but I want you to read this book. And it was a book by Ainsley Green. Is it Ainsley Green? Yeah. And I always try to not call him Al Green. It gets confusing. Anyway, it was basically about our Victorian approach to childhood in this country and how we still resolutely, through all the structures that we work through in public policy, public delivery of services, private sector, we have a Victorian attitude towards children. Rather not see them, rather not have to think about them. Certainly don't want to hear them. And it's changing, it's evolving, and children are welcome in more environments, but we still somehow have a psyche that children are just a bit annoying and a bit get in the way of the rest of life. And that's hard to pin down and it's hard to quantify, but it still persists in policy making and the way that children are treated as a kind of add-on over there. But the origins of childcare and early years education go back to the Industrial Revolution when, it was an economic driver, but then it soon became a philanthropic pursuit, around the kind of appalling conditions children are living in and get about giving them rest and baths and stuff. So it can be both. But we've just got to keep reminding ourselves that this is the most important thing. And as Neil said, if we don't think of children, if we don't think of getting that right at that stage, then there's no hope for our futures. But it's still the political environment we live in at the moment, whether it's across the Atlantic or here, is that's too woke, it's too ambitious, and just get back in your place.
Thank you, Vic.
I was going to share some anecdotes about how irritating and annoying my 15-month-old is, but that's perhaps less relevant to it. But one of the things that's really stuck with me from this conversation is around the role of the childcare worker. And every day you go into work, regardless of the conditions throughout the pandemic, we've talked about the risks involved there. We talk about the opening hours, the long hours, perhaps commutes and the changing patterns around that as well. And every day your priority is to give your best to those children, to that child, to that individual, that family. And the thing for me that really stands out is how are we expecting these individuals, these professionals, these skilled workers to go in and give their best and give their all to the children in their care, that they're educating, when we're looking at the worst cost of living crisis that we've seen, we're looking at rising inflation, we're looking at the cost of rents and mortgages, particularly in London, going through the roof. And you're going into work every day thinking, am I going to be able to make ends meet at the end of the day? Am I going to be able to put food on the table for my children? And I don't think that anyone who is in a childcare provision setting needs to walk through the door of their work environment, whether it's down the stairs, whether it's in a formal setting, and have that burden on their shoulders of not knowing whether they're going to make enough money at the end of the month to pay their bills. And I think unless we've talked a lot about all of the kind of the structural issues here, but when we bring it back to the individual, you're talking about skilled professionals trying to do their best for children who are vulnerable, who are in need of additional support, or for lots of different reasons. And I really think, without a fair wage, without decent terms and conditions, without the rights to time off, for sick pay, for holiday pay, all of these things that employers are inevitably looking at how they can make ends meet themselves, which is in cases passing down to employees. I think there's a really difficult challenge there, and I think that's fundamental to how we reform this. I think, yes, absolutely, the children have to be at the heart of this, and those providing the care have to be very quickly behind that, I think, from our perspective.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, I think we've touched on this already, but, I refer to early educators. I used to refer to it as childcare, but now I very clearly refer to it as early education. I think that's what it is. It's about child development and making sure they're school ready. And we do know from all the research that actually if you invest in early years, you save money in the long term. You don't have, it reduces school exclusions, average earnings are higher, you have less burden on the health service as well. So I think quite often it's short term, isn't it? Governments look at short term issues rather than, as Neil said, having a 10-year strategy for childcare. I think also, I mentioned earlier on that in the recent government consultations about reducing staff ratios, for example, the word quality did not appear once. And I think actually, all of us would want to see a child-centred provision, but where quality is equally as valued as the cost of it.
Thank you. Neil, I know you have answered this, but did you want to add something else briefly?
Just a slightly different angle, and that is that I think you asked the question as to why it's at the bottom of the pile, right? And I think it's partly our problem. When I talk to educators and I ask them why they came in to this sector and this profession, they use words like love, care, want to change the lives of children, want to support. They don't talk about balance sheets, profit and loss accounts, return on capital investment. And we use that. So we're our own worst enemy. And the goodwill gets used and used and used. And if you continually give and give and give, people will take. And that's what's happened. Not necessarily people, but structures. The other reason relates to what Helen said. And I can recall a few years back at one of our annual conferences, an MP standing up and saying, and it was a gentleman, when we were talking about the awful salaries that people are paid in the early years sector, he said, I think we have to be very careful that we don't deprive mothers of earning a bit of pin money. That says it all for me. That's how we view early years. So we don't help ourselves and we are not valued and recognised.
Thank you. Panima.
I think, equally it's also up to us to make that change. I think COVID has proved something that actually, parents recognise the value of early education, and the language and terminology has to change. And I think one of the most important things is that, people's perception, society perception is children who go to earlier settings, they play, and the staff change nappies and they play with the children. That's all the kind of image and perception that they have. But of course, all the issues that they deal with on a day-to-day and how important it is for child development is sometimes forgotten. But I think that's important. That's why we started the campaign. But I think also equally, when politicians are making these policy changes, they go off to other countries to see what things are like and, what's good and what's not so good. But I think we're not comparing like with like here. And my daughter lives in Norway. I have a grandchild who's 2-year-old. She pays £150 per month for childcare. And of course, Astra won't go to school until she's 7. So things are very, very different. The qualified levels of qualifications, there are 70% of staff are fully qualified. And I think, what we need to make sure is actually what is it that we want? What do we mean by early education and childcare? What's the purpose of it? We need to redefine that and make sure the policy then fits into what's important for children and families and providers. And I think that's really fundamental in how we change that perception. It's up to all of us, and not just for politicians, for all of us to make that change.
Thank you very much. And finally, you've all talked about the risks that early years workers put themselves through during the pandemic. And I think quite rightly you've noted the fact that that it wasn't acknowledged in the way that other key workers were acknowledged as well. Can I, on behalf of the committee, thank those early years workers who did do that essential service to keep the economy and the country running. And thank you, panel, for bringing that to our attention. Finally, thank you all so much for what I personally think has been a really productive, really informative session. We have now reached the end of this part of the session, and thank you for attending. We have a few more items of business, and normally I would say, and the chair would say, you can all go now, but I'm going to ask you to just hang on for a couple more minutes until we've finished, because last time we took a photo with the panel, and I'm sure that all the committee would love to do that again. So if you wouldn't mind waiting for a moment, thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion? Can I ask the committee to note its meeting dates as agreed by the London Assembly at its annual meeting on the 4th of May 2023? And the next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 13th of July at 2 p.m. in the chamber here in City Hall. Regarding any other business that I as chair regard urgent, I have no urgent business today, which concludes today's meeting. Thank you.